for arguing about inheritances. Medusa, as you may know, was a Gorgon, but not the only one. She had two sisters, Steno and Euryale, who were immortal. Unlike Medusa, who rather unfairly was born mortal. Their parents were Phorcys and Ceto, a pair of primordial deities whose domain was the sea. Now these two are not exactly household names. They don't often appear in popular retellings, and if you were to invite them to dinner, you'd probably regret it, since Ceto's portfolio included sea monsters of every variety. One imagines awkward conversation over soup, but these genealogical details matter, for they show us how deeply woven into the fabric of the cosmos Medusa was supposed to be. She was not an isolated invention, but part of a lineage of beings representing the primal, terrifying face of nature. To the Greeks, the sea was as much a source of dread as it was of livelihood, and it is hardly surprising that the monsters born of Phorcys and Ceto should carry that aura of danger. What's interesting is that in the earliest Greek art and literature, the Gorgons were not the sort of creatures to inspire gothic horror novels, but rather something far stranger. They were depicted with wide, grinning mouths, boars' tusks, protruding tongues, and sometimes even wings. If you've ever stumbled across one of those Gorgoneon masks, the stylized Gorgon heads carved on temples or shields, you might find them almost comical, with their bulging eyes and stuck-out tongues. They were meant to ward off evil, functioning as protective emblems. Rather like hanging up a beware of dog sign, only in this case the dog happens to petrify trespassers with a glance. Medusa's uniqueness among her sisters is that she alone was mortal. This narrative choice allowed for her eventual defeat at the hands of a hero. Because let's face it, Greek myths always had to give the heroes something dramatic to do. But in her earliest incarnations, she was not necessarily the tragic figure of later retellings. Instead, she was just another monster, part of the background noise of Greek mythology, appearing chiefly to be vanquished. As the centuries passed, however, the story became more complicated. Myths are rather like a recipe that is passed down generations, each cook adding a pinch of spice or a splash of wine, until the dish bears only a faint resemblance to the original. By the time the Roman poet Ovid was writing in his Metamorphoses, Medusa's backstory had developed into something more poignant. Ovid tells us that Medusa was once a beautiful maiden, admired for her flowing hair. So admired, in fact, that Poseidon himself could not resist her. Unfortunately, he chose to pursue her in the temple of Athena, an act which not only violated Medusa, but also desecrated the sacred space. Athena, not known for her soft-heartedness, punished Medusa rather than Poseidon, which does feel like the mythological equivalent of sending the wrong child to bed without supper. The cultural context here is important. To the Greeks, the violation of a temple was a serious offence, and in their moral logic, the defilement of a sacred place demanded retribution. It mattered less who did the deed, and more that the space was dishonoured. Thus, Athena transformed Medusa into the monster we know. Hair of serpents, eyes whose gaze turned men to stone, a face so dreadful that none could look upon it and live. Now, if you pause here and imagine yourself an ancient Greek, you might understand the resonance of this transformation. Snakes, for example, were creatures of both fascination and fear. They shed their skins and thus symbolized renewal, but they also lurked unseen in grass, ready to strike. In mythology, snakes were often linked to chthonic, or underworld forces. To give Medusa a crown of writhing serpents was to mark her as belonging to the liminal space between life and death, beauty and horror, mortal and monstrous. One might also note with a faint smile that the Greeks seem to have a rather loose definition of fair punishment. Athena, rather than confronting her uncle Poseidon, the god of earthquakes, horses, and rather questionable decision-making, decided that the mortal woman would bear the brunt of the consequences. It is perhaps a reflection of the patriarchal structure of Greek society itself, in which women often bore punishment for circumstances well beyond their control. At this stage of the story, Medusa's fate seems sealed. She is no longer the admired maiden, but the feared creature. And yet, interestingly enough, the Greeks did not always treat her image with dread. As mentioned earlier, the Gorgoneion, her severed head, was placed on shields, breastplates, and temple walls. Even Athena, the very goddess who cursed her, bore her likeness on her aegis, that famous protective cloak. In a way, Medusa became a paradox, loathed and feared, yet also invoked for safety and protection. It is as though the very horror she represented could be flipped inside out and transformed into a power against evil. Before we arrive at Perseus, the golden boy destined to lop off Medusa's head, it's worth reflecting on how these myths functioned in everyday Greek life. For us, the story is a work of literature, something to be read in a quiet evening. For them, it was closer to a cultural operating system, guiding their rituals, their fears, their understanding of why the world was the way it was. The figure of Medusa, embodying both beauty and terror, punishment and protection, is a reminder of how comfortable the Greeks were with contradictions. They were not especially bothered by whether a story was morally fair or neatly logical. Myths were not sermons. They were mirrors of the untidy complexity of human life. And so, before Medusa becomes the victim of Perseus's heroics, before her head is swung about like an all-purpose divine weapon, we find her here, standing at the threshold between mortal beauty and monstrous terror. She is the creature of the edge, the guardian of the beyond. To some, a cautionary tale. To others, a symbol of resilience. To all, a face that could never quite be forgotten. If you imagine yourself in ancient Greece, perhaps reclining upon a couch with a cup of wine that may or may not have been watered down according to custom, you would likely hear stories told not in neat chapters, but in a kind of living, evolving web of tales. The myths did not exist as single definitive versions, the way we now expect from novels or films. Instead, each storyteller bent and shaped them according to audience, mood, or even political climate. So it is with Medusa, whose origins are stitched together from the fragments of poets, dramatists, and the wandering bards of a time when memory, not paper, carried knowledge. Her beginnings, however, are consistently linked to a family that might politely be described as eccentric. The Greeks were terribly fond of assigning parentage, even to their monsters. Nothing simply sprang into being without a proper genealogy. And so we return to Medusa's parents, Phorcys and Ceto. Phorcys, you see, was a primordial sea god, older than the Olympians, with the sort of unsettling presence one imagines when gazing into a deep trench where the light fails. His consort, Ceto, was a goddess equally maritime, but less in the way of serene waves and more in the way of squids, sea beasts, and creatures that made sailors regret ever leaving port. Together they populated the mythological seascape, with offspring that make one rather grateful they belong firmly to the realm of imagination. Ladon, the 100-headed serpent, for instance, or Echidna, the so-called mother of monsters, who paired up with Typhon and gave us such memorable creations as Cerberus, the three-headed hound, the Hydra with its many heads, and the Chimera, a sort of lion-goat-serpent ensemble that suggests the gods were sometimes careless with the cosmic glue. Amidst this menagerie, the Gorgons stand out as particularly fearsome. Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, the trio whose very name meant grim or dreadful. In early Greek art, they were shown with grotesque, wide grins, tusks protruding, and often with wings sprouting from their backs. Archaeologists have uncovered Gorgonean masks dating back to the 6th century BCE, placed on temples and shields as protective emblems. These images were less about telling Medusa's story and more about harnessing the raw fright she represented. Rather like hanging up a rather ugly gargoyle above your door, the idea was that ugliness itself could scare away misfortune. But within this family of horrors, Medusa was different. The myths consistently emphasise that she alone was mortal, which, if nothing else, was dramatically convenient for later poets who needed a monster that could, at last, be slain. The sisters Stheno and Euryale were invincible, but Medusa was vulnerable. To the Greek mind, this made her both tragic and useful, a being who could represent danger, yet not be so permanent that no hero could claim a victory. One should also note how these stories reflect geography as much as imagination. The Gorgons were said to dwell at the edge of the world, in places far removed from ordinary Greek life. Some sources placed them near the ocean at the westernmost edge, others in the far north. This edge-of-the-map motif was common in myth. When one sailed beyond familiar waters, where stars grew unfamiliar and currents grew treacherous, it was helpful, psychologically, if not practically, to imagine that monsters dwelled there. After all, how better to discourage young sailors from wandering too far than to tell them a trio of snake-haired sisters were waiting to petrify them? Still, if we step away from the mythology and look at the archaeological record, one sees how potent Medusa's image became in daily life. The Gorgoneon, as it was called, was carved into temple pediments at places like Corfu, glaring out at worshippers and, one supposes, at any passing malevolent spirits. Coins from Sicily carried her face, suggesting that cities adopted her as a kind of civic guardian. To wear or display Medusa was to announce both defiance and protection. It is rather like the modern use of a skull emblem, simultaneously a warning and a declaration of strength. There is also something deeply symbolic in the fact that Medusa alone was not eternal. The Greeks had a knack for embodying human anxieties in their stories, and mortality was the most universal of all. While her sisters represented the unending, almost cosmic terrors of the universe, Medusa represented the fleeting, vulnerable condition of mankind. Yes, she was dangerous, but she could die, just as all mortals must. In that sense, her story bridges the gap between divine myth and human experience. And here we find the beginnings of sympathy for Medusa. Though later centuries would cast her as a tragic figure cursed by Athena, even in the earliest layers of myth, one senses that she is an anomaly, a monster who, unlike her immortal kin, carries the burden of eventual defeat. In literature, she appears almost always in the context of someone else's tale, Perseus's tale, Athena's, even Ovid's broader narrative in the Metamorphoses. Rarely does she stand centre stage as her own protagonist. It is a curious fate. She is both unforgettable and yet constantly overshadowed. The Greeks, of course, were fond of such layered contradictions. Consider that the same culture who painted her as a grotesque, also carved her likeness lovingly into shields and temples. They feared her, yet they needed her. She was the embodiment of terror, but also the charm against it. And perhaps therein lies the true fascination of her myth. She is the monster who cannot be dismissed, because she is also the protector you quietly rely upon. If you close your eyes and picture the temples of the archaic period, their pediments rising in bright paint against a Mediterranean sky, you might see her face staring out with that toothy grin. To the worshippers, she was not merely a villain from a bedtime story, but an active guardian. In that gaze, carved in stone, there was both menace and safety. The paradox of Medusa was literally built into the architecture of their sacred spaces. Of course, when myths live as long as hers have, they acquire layers upon layers of interpretation. Some later writers, looking back, tried to soften the image of the Gorgons. Others hardened it. Some even suggested alternate parentage or differing numbers of sisters. But the core remained. 3 dreadful beings born of the sea, living at the edges of the world, with one, Medusa, fated to fall. One could spend a lifetime cataloguing the small details of these myths, and scholars often have. Was Medusa winged, as early vase paintings show? Did her sisters shriek so loudly that it shook the very ground? Did her face petrify instantly, or only after one met her eyes directly? These questions may sound like idle curiosities, and in a sense they are. Yet they reveal how deeply the Greeks obsessed over consistency in storytelling, while simultaneously allowing contradictions to coexist. And so, before Perseus ever sets out, before Athena sharpens her sense of vengeance, Medusa stands with her sisters as a sentinel of fear, a figure sculpted from the Greeks' fascination with the sea, with mortality, and with the idea that even monsters might serve protective ends. She is mortal, yes, but no less formidable for it. She is not yet the tragic figure cursed for her beauty, nor the severed head brandished as a weapon. She is still simply Medusa, daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, sister to immortal terrors, dwelling at the periphery of the known world. And as the firelight flickered on the walls of an ancient Greek home, and a storyteller's voice rose and fell, one suspects that listeners drifted off to sleep with her image hovering at the edge of their dreams. A monster, yes, but also a mirror of the very fears that haunted the edges of human thought. To move further into the story of Medusa, we must now turn to her most curious distinction, that unlike her sisters, she was mortal. It may sound like a small detail, but in the mythological world of the Greeks, such distinctions mattered greatly. Immortality, after all, was the defining trait of the gods and their monstrous offspring. To be mortal among immortals was to be a walking contradiction. And yet, this was Medusa's lot. Imagine, if you will, being part of a family where everyone but you was immune to age, injury, or death. Rather like being the only one in your household without a decent raincoat on a drizzly day. You are bound to feel singled out. For the poets and storytellers, this odd condition created narrative tension. A monster that could be killed was in truth a monster worth writing about, because it allowed for a story of triumph. But before her eventual downfall at the hands of Perseus, the traditions insist on one thing: Medusa had been beautiful. Not merely pleasant to look at, but dazzling. A woman whose hair was said to be her crowning glory. Now, one might cynically observe that in Greek mythology, such beauty was rarely a blessing. More often, it was a liability. From Helen of Troy, whose beauty supposedly launched 1,000 ships, to Narcissus, whose good looks led him to drown staring at his reflection. The Greeks had a habit of turning beauty into trouble. Medusa's beauty caught the eye of Poseidon. The god of the sea was not exactly a model of restraint. His portfolio included earthquakes, storms, horses, and rather regrettably, a long list of unwanted pursuits of mortals. And so the story goes that he sought out Medusa and, depending on the version you hear, seduced her or forced himself upon her. The setting of this act is crucial: the temple of Athena. Athena, goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and crafts, was famously protective of her temples. To defile one of them was considered an unthinkable crime. Yet, in the way of myths, the blame did not fall upon Poseidon, despite his rather obvious role in the affair. Instead, it fell squarely upon Medusa. The logic is warped, but it reflects the deeply patriarchal society in which these stories were told. Athena, furious at the desecration, punished Medusa by transforming her into the monster we know: serpents for hair, eyes that petrified, a visage so dreadful that one glimpse could end a life. One cannot help but notice the tragic irony. A maiden once praised for her beauty became feared for her ugliness. The very feature that had attracted divine attention, her hair, was twisted into its opposite. Where once it flowed in glossy strands, it now writhed with venomous serpents. Where once her gaze might have captivated admirers, it now turned them to stone. There is, of course, symbolism in all of this. The snake, in Greek thought, was a creature of contradiction. It represented both danger and healing. Consider that Asclepius, god of medicine, carried a staff with a serpent twined around it, a symbol we still use today. Snakes shed their skins, suggesting rebirth, but they also bite, often fatally. To crown Medusa with snakes was to link her permanently with the forces of death and renewal, terror and fascination. Now, depending on one's interpretive lens, Athena's actions can be seen in several ways. Some modern readers see the curse not as punishment, but as protection, transforming Medusa into a figure so formidable that she could no longer be harmed by men. Others view it simply as cruelty, an example of the gods' notorious habit of punishing mortals for offences they did not commit. The ancient sources, for their part, leave the matter ambiguous. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, lingers on Medusa's beauty and downfall, painting her as a tragic victim. Hesiod, much earlier, scarcely mentions the circumstances at all, focusing instead on her monstrous form and her role as Perseus's quarry. Whatever the case, her transformation marked a turning point in how she was remembered. Before, she was one of 3 Gorgon sisters, formidable but not especially unique. Afterward, she became singular, a story all her own. It is curious how tragedy has a way of cementing characters in cultural memory. Without her curse, perhaps Medusa would have remained a minor monster in a footnote of Hesiod. With it, she became unforgettable. We must not forget the cultural context of these myths. To the Greeks, women who violated boundaries, intentionally or not, often faced dire consequences. The myths of Callisto, transformed into a bear for breaking her vow of chastity, or Daphne, pursued by Apollo until she begged for escape and was turned into a laurel tree, remind us of how often female figures bore the brunt of divine whims. Medusa belongs to this sorrowful pattern. Yet even as a monster, she was not wholly reviled. Her head, once severed, became a symbol of protection. Athena paradoxically placed it upon her aegis. Soldiers carried it into battle, carved upon their shields to frighten enemies. How strange that the goddess who cursed Medusa would later appropriate her image as a source of power. But this too was Greek logic. that which is most fearsome can also serve as a talisman. It is worth pausing here to consider the psychology of the petrifying gaze. To be turned to stone is, quite literally, to be paralysed with fear. The metaphor is baked into our language even today. We speak of being frozen in terror. Medusa's power was not simply that she killed, but that she immobilised. She robbed her victims of agency, locking them in place forever. For a society deeply concerned with honour, motion and action, such a fate was worse than death. It was death with humiliation, a permanent reminder of weakness. And so Medusa became more than a monster. She became a symbol of a fate to be dreaded, and by extension, a symbol of divine punishment. To look upon her was to be reminded of one's limits. No warrior, however skilled, could resist the simple act of sight. No shield or spear could save you from the treachery of your own eyes. There is also something of a cosmic balance in her story. The Greeks believed in hubris, the sin of overstepping mortal boundaries, and in Nemesis, the retribution that followed. Medusa, once admired for her beauty, became a warning of how swiftly fortune could turn. To go from celebrated maiden to monstrous exile was to embody the precariousness of human life, a lesson the Greeks never tired of telling. Yet despite her terrifying form, she retains a trace of humanity. Unlike her immortal sisters, she can die. Unlike the other monsters, she has a past, a before and after. We are invited to imagine her not just as a beast, but as a woman who suffered unjustly, who lived with a curse she did not choose. Perhaps this is why she has continued to fascinate for millennia. She is both terrifying and sympathetic, a paradox wrapped in serpents. And so, in this stage of her story, Medusa stands apart from her sisters, marked by mortality, cursed with serpents. Her beauty turned to horror. She lives not in the bustling world of men, but in the distant reaches, a reminder of divine power and human fragility. She is no longer merely one of many children of the sea, but a figure destined for confrontation, her fate sealed in the imaginations of poets and listeners alike. As the Greeks told her story, perhaps by firelight or in the open air of a symposium, one imagines their listeners leaning closer, caught between fear and pity. For here was a tale not only of a monster, but of a maiden undone by forces far beyond her control. A story of transformation, of punishment, and of a beauty that became both her gift and her curse. Yet Medusa's case feels particularly poignant, perhaps because of her lingering humanity. She did not ask for her beauty. She did not ask for Poseidon's pursuit. And she certainly did not ask to be turned into a monster. In her fate, we glimpse a reflection of ancient society's unease with female power. A beautiful woman might attract desire, but too much beauty was dangerous. A woman might serve in a temple, but one misstep, or even no misstep at all, could spell disaster. Medusa embodies these anxieties, and so, from that moment onward, she was cast out, destined to live on the fringes of the world. Different authors place her in different locations, some in Libya, others at the edge of Oceanus, the great river encircling the world. Always, though, she is beyond reach, on the margins of human habitation. There, in solitude, she became the figure that would haunt the imagination for centuries. If you picture her wandering those lonely places, you might almost feel sympathy. She did not choose her fate, and yet she bore it with a kind of grim endurance.